Most people imagine psychological maturity as something visible: confidence, certainty, emotional control, a kind of composed strength that others can recognize immediately. But if you look closely, something doesn't quite match reality, because the people who appear the most confident are not always the most stable, and the people who seem the most composed are not always the most integrated. Carl Jung made an important distinction that often goes unnoticed: the difference between adaptation and individuation. Adaptation is how well you function externally. Individuation is how aligned you are internally. And these two do not always develop at the same pace. You can appear highly functional while remaining internally fragmented. You can seem emotionally controlled while unconsciously avoiding large parts of yourself. This is why psychological maturity is so often misunderstood, because it is not something you can reliably measure from the outside. And more importantly, it does not feel the way most people expect it to feel. There is a moment in development where this becomes clear, not dramatically, but gradually. You begin to notice that maturity is not about becoming more impressive. It is about becoming more stable under pressure, not externally, internally. Consider a simple situation. Something goes wrong. Plans change. Expectations collapse. Earlier in your life, this would have created a strong reaction: frustration, anxiety, the need to regain control. But now, something different happens. The reaction still appears, but it does not take over. You feel it without being consumed by it. Carl Jung described this as a shift in the relationship between the ego and the unconscious. The ego is no longer overwhelmed by emotional material. It can contain it without repression. And that word matters: containment. Because maturity is not about eliminating emotional responses. It is about holding them without collapsing into them. You begin to notice that emotions move through you differently. They arise, they are felt, but they do not define your behavior in the same immediate way. And this creates a form of quiet stability, not dramatic, not visible, but consistent. Let's look at another example. You receive criticism, not necessarily accurate, not entirely fair. Earlier, this might have triggered defensiveness. You would have explained yourself, corrected the misunderstanding, protected your position. Now, something changes. You still register the criticism. You still evaluate it. But you do not feel the same urgency to defend. You can hold the discomfort without immediately reacting to it. Carl Jung believed that this capacity reflects a more integrated ego, one that is no longer fragile in the face of external input, because fragility requires constant protection. Stability does not. And this is one of the first real signs of maturity. You no longer need to protect your identity at every moment, not because you don't care, but because your sense of self is no longer built on unstable ground. Now, consider something even more subtle: disagreement. Someone sees things differently than you. They interpret a situation in a way you know is incomplete. Earlier, this would have activated your awareness. You would have corrected, explained, refined. Now, something shifts. You can allow the disagreement to exist without needing to resolve it, without needing to win, without needing to establish clarity immediately. Carl Jung emphasized that mature consciousness includes the ability to hold tension between opposites, to allow conflicting perspectives without collapsing into certainty. And this capacity changes how you relate to others. You become less reactive in conversation, less driven to convince, less invested in being understood perfectly, and more capable of simply engaging without needing to control the outcome. This is not passivity. It is proportion. You begin to recognize that not every situation requires your intervention. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every dynamic needs to be resolved. And this recognition reduces psychological strain, because much of what previously created tension was the need to manage everything. Now, let's bring this into a more personal space. You reflect on yourself, not in a dramatic way, not in a self-critical way, but simply noticing your patterns, your tendencies, your reactions. Earlier, self-reflection may have carried a certain intensity. You were trying to improve, to fix, to become better. Now, something softens. You still observe yourself, but without the same pressure to change immediately. Carl Jung believed that true individuation includes accepting the psyche as it is, not in a passive sense, but in a realistic one, because forced change often creates resistance, while understanding creates movement. You begin to see your limitations more clearly, but without turning them into problems. You recognize your patterns, but without building identity around them. You see yourself more accurately, and this accuracy is what maturity actually feels like. Not superiority, not certainty, but proportion. You are no longer exaggerating your strengths. You are no longer denying your weaknesses. You are no longer constructing yourself through extremes. You are simply aligned. This is why maturity often feels quieter than expected. It does not create a strong internal narrative. It does not constantly confirm itself. It does not need to be recognized. It stabilizes quietly. You may even question it, because it lacks intensity. It lacks drama. It lacks the feeling of becoming something new. But Jung would suggest that this absence is not a lack of growth. It is a sign that growth has been integrated. What once required effort now functions naturally. What once required awareness now exists without it. And this creates a different kind of strength, not the strength of control, but the strength of flexibility. You can adapt without losing yourself. You can feel without being overwhelmed. You can engage without needing to dominate. And this becomes visible in very small moments. How you respond to stress, how you handle misunderstanding, how you relate to uncertainty, how you carry yourself when nothing is being asked of you. Carl Jung often pointed out that the most important psychological developments are not the ones that feel the most intense, but the ones that remain stable over time. Because intensity fades, but stability holds. And this is where the real shift becomes undeniable. You are no longer trying to appear mature. You are no longer trying to feel mature. You are functioning from a place that does not require confirmation. And that is what makes it real. What begins to clarify at this stage is that maturity is not a performance of stability. It is the absence of instability needing to be managed. And this distinction changes everything. Because most people, without realizing it, are still relating to growth through performance. They regulate their emotions. They control their reactions. They present themselves in composed ways. And from the outside, this can look like maturity. But Carl Jung made a crucial observation. What is controlled is not necessarily integrated. Control can be a function of suppression. Integration is a function of relationship. And these two operate very differently within the psyche. In earlier stages of development, emotional control often requires effort. You feel something strongly, and you manage it. You contain it. You override the impulse. This is not inherently wrong. Jung understood that the ego must develop a certain level of control in order to function in the world. But control is not the final stage, because what is controlled remains separate. What is integrated becomes part of you, and this is where maturity begins to shift from effort to structure. You are no longer holding things together, because they are no longer fragmented in the same way. Carl Jung described this as a more stable relationship between the ego and the unconscious. The ego is no longer overwhelmed by unconscious material, but it is also no longer fighting it. There is communication. There is recognition. There is space. And from that space, something changes in how you experience yourself. You stop needing to manage every reaction, because reactions themselves begin to change. They lose intensity. They lose urgency. They lose their ability to destabilize you. Not because you are suppressing them, but because they are no longer amplified by unconscious tension. Let's take a closer look at this. Earlier in life, a small trigger could create a disproportionate reaction, a comment, a tone of voice, a situation that touched something unresolved, and the reaction would feel immediate, compelling, difficult to interrupt. Carl Jung referred to these as complexes, clusters of emotional material that operate semi-autonomously within the psyche. When a complex is activated, it can temporarily take control of perception and behavior. This is why reactions can feel so intense. But as individuation progresses, these complexes begin to lose their grip, not because they disappear, but because they become conscious. And once something becomes conscious, it changes its relationship to the ego. You begin to recognize the reaction as it arises. You see it, you feel it, but you are not fully inside it anymore. Carl Jung emphasized that this ability to observe without being possessed is one of the defining features of psychological development. And over time, this observation changes the reaction itself, because what is seen repeatedly begins to lose its automatic power. So instead of needing to control your reactions begin to require less control. This is a completely different experience, and it is often mistaken for emotional detachment. But it is not detachment. It is integration. You still feel, but you are not overwhelmed. You still respond, but you are not driven. And this creates a form of stability that is not visible in dramatic ways. It shows up in what does not happen. You do not escalate. You do not overreact. You do not collapse under pressure. Carl Jung believed that maturity is not defined by what you can display, but by what no longer controls you. Now, this leads to another important shift, the difference between identity performance and identity coherence. Earlier in development, identity often requires reinforcement. You need to feel consistent. You need to confirm who you are. You need to maintain a certain image of yourself, internally and externally. And this creates effort, because identity must be protected. Carl Jung observed that when the ego is not securely aligned with the self, it compensates by constructing rigid identities, roles, labels, definitions, and these identities require constant maintenance. But as integration deepens, identity becomes less rigid, not unstable, but flexible. You no longer need to define yourself in the same fixed way. You can adapt to different situations without feeling like you are losing who you are. And this is where coherence replaces performance. You are not acting consistent. You are consistent across situations, across emotional states, across different environments, because your sense of self is no longer dependent on maintaining a specific image. It is grounded in something deeper. Carl Jung would say that the ego has come into a more stable relationship with the self. And from that relationship, identity no longer needs to be constructed. It emerges naturally. This is why maturity often feels less impressive than expected, because it removes the need to appear anything. There is no performance, no emphasis, no internal pressure to demonstrate stability. And this can be misunderstood, especially in a culture that equates growth with visible change. You may look at yourself and think, I don't feel dramatically different. I'm not constantly aware. I'm not always in control. But Jung would suggest that these expectations belong to earlier stages, where growth feels like effort, like movement, like transformation. At deeper stages, growth feels like normalization. What once required attention now happens automatically. What once felt like progress now feels like baseline. And this is why it becomes harder to recognize, because it no longer stands out. Let's bring this into a concrete example. You experience a difficult moment, something frustrating, something unexpected. Earlier, you would have needed to manage your reaction. You would have reminded yourself to stay calm, to stay aware, to respond rather than react. Now, you simply respond, not because you are trying to, but because there is nothing pushing you out of alignment. Carl Jung described this as a reduction in internal conflict. The psyche becomes less divided, less contradictory, less pulled in opposing directions. And when internal conflict decreases, behavior stabilizes naturally. You are no longer negotiating with yourself constantly. You are no longer trying to override parts of yourself. You are operating from a more unified position. And this is what gives maturity its quiet quality. It does not need to assert itself, because it is not compensating for instability. It is the result of stability. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation leads toward wholeness, not perfection. Wholeness includes contradictions, emotions, limitations, but it integrates them into a structure that can hold them without collapsing. And this is where the final distinction becomes clear. Maturity is not about eliminating difficulty. It is about no longer being destabilized by it. You still face challenges. You still experience emotion. You still encounter uncertainty. but your relationship to these experiences has changed. You are not thrown off center as easily, and when you are, you return more quickly, more naturally, without excessive effort. And that is the key, the absence of excessive effort, because performance requires effort, but integration does not. Carl Jung believed that when the ego is aligned with the self, life begins to feel less like something you must control and more like something you can participate in, without losing yourself, without needing to define yourself constantly, without needing to prove anything. And that is why real maturity often goes unnoticed, not because it is small, but because it is stable. What ultimately reveals psychological maturity is not what you understand, but how you live when nothing is being tested. Because at this stage, development is no longer something you apply. It is something that expresses itself without effort. Carl Jung often emphasized that individuation is not proven through insight, but through how the personality functions over time. Not in rare moments of clarity, but in ordinary, repeated situations. And this is where maturity becomes unmistakable. Not dramatic, not performative, but consistent. You begin to notice that your behavior no longer swings in the same way. Not because you are controlling it, but because the internal forces that once created those swings have stabilized. Let's start with something simple. Delay. Something doesn't go as planned. You are kept waiting. An outcome is postponed. Earlier, this would have created internal friction, restlessness, irritation, a subtle resistance to what is happening. Now, something changes. You still prefer things to move forward, but the resistance does not build in the same way. You can wait without turning the moment into tension. Carl Jung would describe this as a reduction in unconscious urgency. The ego is no longer reacting to time or control as threats to its stability. And this shift is small, but profound, because much of daily stress comes not from events themselves, but from resistance to them. Now, consider something more interpersonal. Someone behaves in a way that is inconsistent. One day they are engaged, another day they are distant. Earlier, this inconsistency might have activated interpretation. You would try to understand it, explain it, possibly internalize it. Now, your response is different. You notice it, but you do not immediately attach meaning to it. You allow the behavior to exist without making it about you. Carl Jung emphasized that mature individuals withdraw unnecessary projections. They no longer fill gaps in understanding with assumptions that stabilize their identity. And this changes your emotional landscape because you are no longer constantly interpreting reality through personal significance. You are experiencing it more directly, without distortion. Let's move into something even more revealing. Failure. Something does not work. You make a mistake. An outcome falls short. Earlier, this might have created a strong internal reaction, self-criticism, overanalysis, a need to correct quickly. Now, something subtle shifts. You register the failure. You reflect on it, but you do not collapse into it. Your sense of self remains intact. Carl Jung believed that when the ego is properly aligned to the self, it no longer equates outcomes with identity. Failure becomes information, not definition. And this creates a different kind of resilience. Not the resilience of pushing through, but the resilience of not being destabilized in the first place. Now, consider how this shows up in communication. You are in a conversation. There is space. Silence appears. Earlier, you might have felt the need to fill it, to maintain flow, to keep engagement alive. Now, silence feels different. It is not uncomfortable. It is not something to fix. It simply exists. Carl Jung often pointed out that the more integrated a person becomes, the less they fear emptiness, because they are no longer dependent on constant stimulation to maintain psychological balance. And this extends beyond conversation, into life itself. You become less driven to fill every moment, less compelled to optimize every experience, less focused on extracting meaning from everything. You begin to allow life to unfold, without constant interference. This is where maturity becomes deeply visible, not in what you do, but in what you no longer need to do. You do not need to react immediately. You do not need to interpret constantly. You do not need to defend your position. You do not need to prove your awareness. And this absence of compulsion creates space. Space to respond instead of react. space to observe instead of conclude, space to exist without constant psychological movement. Carl Jung believed that this space is where the psyche begins to regulate itself more naturally, without excessive effort from the ego, without force control, without internal conflict dominating behavior. Now, let's look at something even more subtle. How you experience yourself when nothing is happening. No pressure, no interaction, no challenge. Earlier, these moments may have been filled with mental activity, reflection, analysis, planning, a need to stay engaged internally. Now, something changes. You can simply be, without needing to improve, without needing to understand, without needing to become. Carl Jung described this as a deeper alignment with the self, where the individual no longer feels compelled to constantly shape their experience. They can exist within it. And this is where maturity reaches its most stable expression, because it is no longer dependent on conditions. It does not require challenge to prove itself. It does not require difficulty to activate. It remains present, even in stillness. You may also notice a change in how you relate to others' perceptions of you. Someone misunderstands you. Someone judges you inaccurately. Earlier, this might have created discomfort, a need to correct, a need to clarify. Now, the reaction is lighter. You recognize the misunderstanding, but you do not feel the same urgency to resolve it. Carl Jung believed that when the ego is no longer dependent on external validation, it becomes less reactive to misperception, not indifferent, but grounded, because identity is no longer fragile. And this creates a quiet confidence, not the kind that asserts itself, but the kind that remains unaffected. You do not need to be seen accurately at all times, because you are no longer constructing yourself through others' perceptions. And this reduces a significant amount of psychological pressure. You become easier in your own experience, less guarded, less reactive, more available. And all of this happens without effort. That is the key, because if it requires effort, it is still performance. Carl Jung was very clear about this distinction. What is integrated does not need to be maintained constantly. It sustains itself. And that is what you begin to feel. A sense of internal coherence. Your thoughts, emotions, and actions are no longer pulling in different directions. They are aligned, not perfectly, but consistently enough to create stability. And this stability is what defines real psychological maturity. Not perfection, not constant awareness, not emotional control, but coherence. You remain yourself across different situations, across different emotional states, across different challenges. And this continuity is what makes maturity real, because it is not dependent on conditions. It is built into how you function. Carl Jung believed that this is the closest the individual comes to wholeness, not as a fixed state, but as an ongoing integration that stabilizes over time. And from this place, life begins to feel different, not easier, but less fragmented, not controlled, but more fluid, not defined, but more coherent. And that coherence is what allows you to move through life without constantly trying to become something else. Because what you are is no longer in conflict with itself. There's a point in psychological development where something quietly disappears. Not your awareness, not your growth, but the need to recognize yourself as someone who has grown. And this absence changes everything. Because for a long time, maturity may have been something you were aware of. You noticed your reactions. You tracked your progress. You evaluated how you handle situations. Carl Jung described this phase as a necessary stage of conscious development. The ego observes itself, reflects, and gradually refines its behavior through awareness. But that phase cannot last forever, because constant self-observation carries a hidden tension. It keeps you slightly outside of your own experience, always measuring, always checking, always adjusting. And at a certain point, that tension begins to dissolve. Not because you stop growing, but because growth no longer requires your constant attention. You begin to trust your structure. You begin to trust your responses. You begin to trust that you will remain stable, even without monitoring yourself. Carl Jung believed that individuation ultimately leads to a state where the ego no longer needs to control the process of development. It participates in it. And that participation feels different. You are no longer trying to respond correctly. You simply respond. You are no longer trying to be composed. You simply remain composed. You are no longer trying to be mature. And that is precisely why maturity becomes real. Because what is real does not need to be maintained through effort. It sustains itself. You may begin to notice this in subtle ways. You move through situations without overthinking your reactions. You handle tension without needing to analyze it in the moment. You recover from difficulty without turning it into a long, internal process. And perhaps most importantly, you stop turning yourself into a project. Carl Jung warned that the ego can become attached even to self-improvement, constantly refining, constantly optimizing, constantly trying to become better. But at deeper stages of individuation, this orientation begins to shift. You are no longer trying to improve yourself at every moment. You are allowing yourself to function. And this creates a kind of psychological ease that is often mistaken for complacency. But it is not complacency. It is integration. Because the parts of you that once required attention have become part of your natural way of being. You are no longer constructing yourself. You are expressing yourself. And this expression is not forced. It is not shaped by the need to appear a certain way. It is grounded in something more stable. Carl Jung often emphasized that true maturity does not eliminate imperfection. It changes your relationship to it. You still make mistakes. You still experience emotion. You still encounter uncertainty. But none of these destabilize your sense of self in the same way, because your identity is no longer built on avoiding them. It is built on containing them. And this is where maturity becomes deeply human. Not ideal, not perfected, but coherent. You are no longer trying to remove parts of yourself to feel whole. You are allowing those parts to exist without letting them take over. And this creates a balance that is not rigid. It is flexible, alive, responsive. Carl Jung believed that this is what wholeness actually means. Not the absence of conflict, but the ability to hold it. Not the elimination of tension, but the capacity to live with it. And when this becomes your natural state, something important shifts. You stop asking, am I doing this right? Am I reacting correctly? Am I as aware as I should be? Because those questions belong to a stage where identity is still being formed. Now, identity is no longer the focus. Function is. You live, you respond, you adjust, without needing to constantly define what that means. And this is why real psychological maturity often goes unnoticed. It does not signal itself. It does not announce itself. It does not require recognition, but it is present in everything you do. Before you leave, take a moment to reflect on something simple, not intellectually, but honestly. When you face difficulty now, do you still feel the need to control yourself? Or do you trust how you will respond? That question reveals more than any definition of maturity ever could. If you've noticed that your responses have become quieter, more stable, less reactive, without you having to force them, share that moment, not as proof, not as achievement, just as recognition. Because someone else may still believe that maturity must feel intense, when in reality, it often feels like something far more subtle. Something that doesn't demand attention, but quietly changes how you live. And if this perspective helped you see your growth differently, continue with this work, not to become better, but to remain aligned with what is already becoming stable within you. Because as Carl Jung understood, maturity is not something you reach. It is something that remains. When nothing inside you needs to prove itself anymore,